Well, let's see. Looks like we have a decent number of people signed on, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Claire Sadar. I am the program manager here at Historic New England. And if you are not familiar with Historic New England, we are the largest, oldest regional heritage preservation organization in the country. And tonight we are having a wonderful Zoom webinar on the conservation of ancient objects here at Historic New England with Michaela Neiro, our objects conservator. Before we get started with the actual program, let me just give you a few ground rules of how this will work. So this is a webinar format, so you unfortunately can't speak or be seen on video. But if you do have questions, we're happy to answer them at the end. There's a button called Q&A that if you hit it, you can enter your questions there. It's a lot better for us for managing questions in the chat. So please, if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A function. It'll be easier for us to find them. This webinar is being recorded, so if you need to rewatch it or you miss some of it, you can do so. We will be sending out a link to the recording to everyone who registered in a follow-up email. We also have closed captions available. You can turn those on and off with the menu bar in your Zoom window. And if you have questions about that or about any other technical problems, you can put those in the chat function. I will be monitoring the chat throughout the webinar. So if you're having any difficulties, you can contact me that way. So right now, I'm happy to turn it over to Michaela, who's going to give us a really fascinating presentation about Asian objects in our collection and how we are conserving them. So Michaela, thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Hi, everybody. First, I just want to kind of outline the format of this talk because it could be a little confusing. I'm going to start talking about the China trade in general and how these objects came to our collections at Historic New England, and then talk a little bit about conservation practices in general, and then specifically considering Asian objects, the difference between how we treat these objects here in the West and how they might be treated in their home countries in the East, and then show some specific examples from our collection of treatments. And anyone you see in these treatments, like Ellen in this picture below, that's not me, is one of our postgraduate fellows. Every year we have a postgraduate fellow at Historic New England in the Conservation Lab, and they've all been wonderful. We've had some amazing fellows, and they rotate almost every year. Some stay for 2 years, but a lot of great work has been done by them. So at that, we will get on with it. So a little bit about how the objects came to our collection. We start with some great lacquer objects. So folding tables, sewing tables like these, porcelains like these were brought to New England through as prized possessions were brought to New England through the China trade as prized possessions of the wealthy people like Harrison Gray Otis. Here's his withdrawing room, which is in the Federal style, classical proportions, delicate details, but decorated and highlighted with this lacquer backgammon set and these Chinese style furniture. So it was very desirable, the Asian look and the Asian objects. So about the China trade, the Portuguese were the first Western nations to trade with China, but by 1600, the British East India Company was established with silk, tea, and porcelains being a primary import. Here you see the port of Macau, and that was the first stop. It was controlled by Portugal, and it lay at the mouth of the Pearl River, which led up to Canton, the most important cultural and economic city in South China. These ports and the structure around the trade was very regulated. So here are the steps as seen in these paintings. The next place to go from Macau was up the river to Whampoa. Here, a fast boat would go up and see if they the captains had permission to sail up the Pearl River to this stop. So the ships would come up here and stay anchored. This was the anchorage. The collector of customs was hired here by the captain, and who would supply the ship with food, offload whatever cargo the Western captains brought, and wait for the captain to return with the goods. Then the captain and high-level crew would go up the river to just outside the Canton city walls to these hangs, or factories, which made products specifically for the Western market. And each country had their own residence and trading headquarters. So these paintings of the ports were also very popular, and they helped Westerners back home understand how the China trade worked and to dream about the exotic Far East. And they kind of served as postcards do today. So after the American Revolution, trade with China played a key role in the development of New England's economy and held the promise of great wealth. New England ships took ginseng from the Appalachian Mountains or furs from the Pacific Northwest to sell in China. And they returned with cargoes of silk, porcelain, teas, and luxury furnishings to satisfy the growing taste, not only for these furnishings, but for all things exotic. So enter the Quincy family. Already wealthy from privateering, Colonel Josiah Quincy builds this elegant mansion with Chinese fretwork balustrade, we'll point out, and decorated with all kinds of fineries, including Chinese lacquer, porcelain, and bamboo furniture. Relative of the Quincy's, Major Samuel Shaw, was aboard the first American ship to sail to China. It was called the Empress of China, and it sailed in 1784. Shaw returned from this trip with a host of personal items, including this whist game set and porcelains, all with Abigail Quincy's initials monogrammed onto the objects. So these were extra special objects for a special ship captain, made for him, for who he wanted to give them to. The objects made for the Chinese export. So the point that I'm making there is that, I'll go back, the specialty objects made for the friends and families of the merchants were generally of higher quality than the objects that were just bought to resell in the West. And these later became the most desirable collectible objects that end up in museum collections. So by the 19th century, the objects made for export changed. The quality declined, the decoration became gaudier, and at the same time, the English and American porcelain factories had developed the skills to replicate Chinese porcelains. So these porcelains could be purchased in America and Europe for less money than it cost to import from China. So as the quality in China went down, the quality in the West went up. By the late 19th century, advances in transportation brought on a period of tourist travel, and the items for the tourist market were even lesser quality than had been made over the last 150 years. So then comes the age of the interior decorators. So by the early 20th century, we've gone from acquiring high quality Asian objects through the China trade to certain people collecting them once they're already in the US, and then to using them as decoration. So the Codman estate, built in 1740 by John Codman, he amassed a fortune through shipping and trade. Many of the objects in the house he collected through the China trade, but the more well-known Codman is Ogden Codman Jr., who grew up with the splendors of the China trade in his house. He traveled in Europe, and he became a successful early 20th century architect and designer. He wrote a book called The Decoration of Houses, which he co-authored with the writer Edith Wharton, and he designed homes for society friends. including bedroom interiors at the Breakers in Newport. So here you see the morning room at the Codman estate that he decorated in the early 20th century, where he's mixing French furniture and French blue and white toile fabric with the classic blue and white Chinese ceramics and other Rococo details in what we would now call chinoiserie style. So that's a French word for like after the Chinese taste. But he wasn't trying to replicate Chinese style. It was this image of fanciful, romantic, exotic Asian imagery. So that's really what chinoiserie means. So speaking of fanciful, by 1924, Henry Sleeper, another early professional interior designer, possibly the first American interior designer, creates what he called the China Trade Room at his summer home and design showcase known as Beauport. This painting by William Rankin shows the room how it would have looked during Sleeper's lifetime, with dark lacquer furniture, imitation pagoda, jade vases, all contributing to this sense that the viewer has been transported in time and place to a fictionalized, almost surreal and magical perception of the Orient. So not really how things looked in Asia, but the Western perception of it. The room came to be, though, spurred by the discovery of this 18th century Chinese export wallpaper that happened to be in an attic in Marblehead. Sleeper liked to use old things and hunted around for antiques. He found this high quality Chinese paper and got the idea for the China Trade Room from this paper. So this paper, made in China, depicts two important occupations, the cultivation of rice and the production of porcelain. And this is not a great picture, but here you can see all the porcelains on the shelf and painting the porcelain, and here's preparing the clay. So porcelain was so important to the Chinese that they depicted the creation of it in this wallpaper. So after Sleeper died and the house and the contents were purchased by the McCann family, the only room they altered was this room to make it a more comfortable sitting room for themselves. And they used this Chinese Chippendale furniture. So all this yellow upholstered furniture and these tables are English-made furniture in the Chinese style. So again, that chinoiserie concept. In the adjacent central hall, Sleeper used this paper, definitely chinoiserie, to continue his kind of exotic fantasy. So this low quality American-made wallpaper shows Chinese style figures, we'll say, in robes and the phoenix and the flowers. So this was all contributing to this fanciful, exotic chinoiserie style. So now on to conservation. So basically, there are a few key differences between how Conservator from the West would approach the treatment of an Asian object as compared to a conservator from the East or from the country that the object is from. And I don't mean that one is better than the other, it's just different. And a lot of it has to do with abilities, and a lot has to do with sensitivities. So really the key difference is that in the Eastern conservators, the goal is for the object to look as good as possible. And to get there, you may end up re-lacquering something. So using the Urushi lacquer to recoat, to make shiny again, to stabilize lifting flakes. And that not only do most Western conservators not have access to this material, but it takes years of practice to learn how to use. and we just don't have that. We haven't been taught that way. In general, in the West, our concepts for conservation are to use materials different from the original object so that they can be easily distinguished and hopefully removed. So Westerners tend to use stable, inert, but synthetic materials. These materials are reversible. The repairs are detectable under certain lighting, like UV lighting, or upon very close inspection, but they're not obvious, and minimal intervention. Whereas in the East, you might use this irreversible but original material, like Urushi lacquer. You might, if something is very badly damaged, it really wouldn't be displayed at all. There wouldn't be the desire to repair and display. It would, you put your damaged object away and have a new one out on view. Oftentimes no aesthetic repairs are made at all. So I will continue talking about this topic, but I hope that made sense. So one way to kind of just describe this concept is through Japanese scroll conservation. Now, I didn't do any of these or did not attend this workshop, but it's more about the concept where these hanging scrolls, or they're both hanging and rolled scrolls, the approach is very different from the East or the West. So in the West, we would save the fabric borders every bit and try to preserve and restore these old materials. Whereas in the East, these are meant to be expendable. Once the scroll has been rolled and unrolled a certain number of times, the silk border starts to fail and it gets replaced. And so here's an example of replacing the border. So the backing papers, the strings, the silks are replaced when they are worn out. Braided cords. So there's an example at Beauport of another great Asian object. In this central hall, inside this cabinet, are a variety of ceramics. And several years ago, one of our postgraduate fellows, Colleen O'Shea, was examining these ceramics and discovered that many appeared to be Japanese or Korean. And 5 of these vessels appeared to be repaired in the traditional kintsugi method. This is a skilled and valued art of mending ceramics using Asian lacquer and sprinkling that lacquer mend with precious metals like gold or silver. The repairs are intentionally visible due to the line of gold or silver along the crack and flaw in the object. The use of precious metal in repair is meant to convey that the repaired object has its own beauty. A ceramic might be damaged, but mending it gives it new life. Christy Bartlett wrote that kintsugi repairs serve to show the lifespan of the ceramic, that it has been used, knocked around a bit and fallen, and these outward signs of existence are qualities that are appreciated in the Japanese tea room. If this technique is used, it imparts additional value to the object in terms of both aesthetics and history. A true kintsugi repair requires extensive training in the art of lacquer. The process of making the repair is exacting, time-consuming, and difficult. It's possible to imitate kintsugi with modern materials by using metallic paint, bronze powders, or mica powders in synthetic binders, which is something a forger or someone without knowledge of the art of lacquer could perform, like a Western Conservator. There are even new kintsugi kits that you can purchase. So because so little was known about the history of these objects, the 5 ceramics from Beauport were investigated to better understand their composition, with the ultimate goal to determine whether or not they were true kintsugi repairs. They were examined under ultraviolet radiation as a preliminary step in order to detect differences in materials. So here is the white bowl under UV light. And metals like gold do not fluoresce under UV, but modern adhesives and lacquers do. So this is good first step to think that, yes, this could be a true kintsugi repair. Following this, conservation scientists at SUNY Buffalo State analyzed the objects with X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy, or XRF, and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, FTIR. And those indicate whether you have gold or other metals in XRF, and FTIR can pinpoint lacquer. Finally, samples from the break edges on the two objects were removed and then mounted in cross sections in order to help discern the layering structure of the repairs. So this white bowl appears to have 4 distinct layers of lacquer before the gold layer. Judging by this cross section, the gold on this bowl appears to have been heavily embedded in the uppermost layer of lacquer. So again, a true kintsugi repair we have here. Colleen conducted a separate study in order to find a way to simulate kintsugi repairs using conservation grade materials. In case that conservation of a previously kintsugi repaired vessel is needed. Broken stoneware ceramics belonging to Colleen were repaired with several different techniques in order to gauge a way to imitate a true kintsugi repair. And on to another project. Now we're back at the Quincy house. A few years ago, Historic New England revisited the period of interpretation of this house from the Revolutionary War and its hero, Josiah Quincy, to the late 1880s, the time the house was lived in by Josiah's great-granddaughter, Eliza Susan Quincy. She spent a good part of her life writing about the house and protecting it. She persuaded many of her relatives to return heirlooms to the house so that they might be on display in their original setting. She also had great documentary photos taken of the entire house, like this one. So we know exactly where everything was. So we're looking at these beautiful vases next, prominently displayed on the mantle aside Copley portrait of Josiah Quincy. So although Eliza Susan's record she had the story wrong about these vases slightly. She thought they were from Japan. She thought they were 300 years old. They're really only 200 years old. The fact is they're high quality vases that were brought back from early on in the China trade and were likely not made for the West. They were made for a Chinese ownership, but were a gift or somehow given to a Quincy family member. But you can see what the problem is here. Clearly the vases were important enough to keep, even though they were severely damaged. The neck was ground, the break edge was ground down to be a little neater and smoother and painted red along the edge. So Elizabeth's task was to make a new neck for this vase. So she did this by taking a mold of the original, of the neck of the intact one, and using plasticine in order to make an outer mold so that then she could make a silicone mold. Here she's pouring the silicone in, and then she cast the silicone around the neck in order to then pour plaster in to make the cast. So here she is making the plaster cast. You can see this slight problem. When she was finished, she realized that the original neck on the vase on the left was slightly larger than the one on the right. This is an indication that these vases were hand thrown and they just varied slightly. So another indication that they were handmade, not mold made, high quality vases. So after Elizabeth sanded her plaster fill to fit the vase she was trying to match, you see it there. And then she proceeded to airbrush and in paint the plaster fill. So here she's airbrushed the interior And after airbrushing the exterior, she's adding some gold decoration. And here they are after treatment, looking fantastic. You can't tell at all that it was a replacement. Another approach to treating ceramics is seen in this vase, very large vase. You'll see in the next picture. Here's Ellen. So you can see the top is broken. It's very heavy. I could imagine these things falling over pretty easily. The bottom actually was fairly broken too, so maybe someone dropped it. But the main issue upon close inspection was with the glaze. Here you see all these various areas of lost glaze. It just, oh, I'm sorry, it just chipped out. Kind of the whole colorway would be lost. This was made likely around 1860, 1880, and the coloring, the pinks and purples were kind of a new color to the Chinese ceramics, and they were slightly unstable, these pastel colors. So possibly had something to do with the white that was added to the pigments, because all the pastel colors had this flaking problem. So what Ellen did was make a paste of epoxy using these natural pigments and bulking agents and clear epoxy, and then carefully filled in the areas that were missing. So the epoxy not only replaced the color, but also stabilized any lifting or delicate glaze material. So the next treatment we'll talk about is also from the Quincy house, also treated by Ellen Promise. It's this beautiful lacquer sewing table. So it was made for export, and we know that because this form was not a Chinese form. Sewing tables were very popular in New England, in America. They were used by women, and they had a fabric bag that hung underneath to hold findings and fabrics and threads and things. You can see the box, the top of the table open, displays all these little containers that had thimbles and needles and such. So the interior of this looked great. It was in amazing condition, but the exterior was slightly cracked and flaking. And this happens for several reasons. It's mostly climate related, change in temperature and humidity, especially in New England, where houses have very high humidity in the summer and then are heated and very dry in the winter. The substrate of these tables is wood, and with expansion and contraction, the wood moves and then the lacquer flakes because it is actually very rigid. You saw that on the top, the thickness of the lacquer is pretty substantial. This, instead of having lots of small flakes, had just this one big crack, again, due to the wood substrate below. Whereas the legs, which were a less prominent part of the table, the lacquer was much thinner and had many more areas of flaking. So in this case, Ellen is using a natural material called fish glue to to stabilize the lifting lacquer. She's using an Asian clamping method called shimbari. This is a frame and these sticks of bamboo to apply pressure just where you want them, especially on things that you couldn't use a clamp for. It would be very difficult to clamp the top of this box, but this shimbari frame works wonderfully. And here's the tip to show the detail and the beautiful detail of the lacquer work and the gold powders on the surface. And there's some clamping of the legs. What made this treatment extra special, there's many different ways to infill lacquer. So again, we're not using real lacquer. In Asia, that's what they would do. More layers of urushi lacquer, pigmented. So Ellen experimented with some acrylic materials and came up with a material that looked very similar. So here on the left is the underside of the leg of the table. And here is a cast film of golden acrylic medium mixed with golden acrylic paint. And she cast it out on a sheet of mylar using these sticks, popsicle sticks, to ensure that the level of her film was even and the level she wanted. So it was only that thick, the thickness of a popsicle stick. And here, so she would trace in mylar the areas of loss, so these tiny little pieces, and then lay that mylar over her film of acrylic and cut them out with a little scalpel. So here's some more examples of the cut pieces. And then those little acrylic flakes would be glued into place where the lacquer was missing. She used a variety of paint pens. These are watercolor paints with mica powders. And then here are some other mica powders and powdered gold to try to replicate the gold decoration on the top of the box. Here's what we call a mock-up or a test, where she's testing the different materials to see the fineness of the line and the color and what she can achieve to match the rose gold and lemon gold of the decoration on the sewing table. Here is one of her acrylic fills, and here is the same fill after being in-painted with the various paint pens and powdered gold. And after treatment, she put it all back together and recreated the box, the sewing bag, based on small fragments of fabric that were left under the tacks on the underside of the table. So a very successful treatment. Here's another quick example of a lacquer treatment. This lacquer box was on the sun porch at Beauport. So you can imagine the sun porch got a lot of sun. And lacquer is generally water resistant, very, very durable. But when exposed to sun, it begins to deteriorate. It becomes water soluble and it can flake. So in this case, that happened here. So what I did was to brush a consolidating coat of an acrylic adhesive over the whole box. It's actually a box. And that just saturated the lacquer, brought some of the color back and the shine that you expect to see with Asian lacquer. And now for something completely different, let me just find my place. So I'm gonna go back one more. Actually, I'll go back two more. Asian lacquer, a little history on lacquer. Its Japanese name, urushi, is found throughout Asia. Lacquer is produced from the sap of various trees in the poison ivy family. It's been used since ancient time and continues to be made today. And artifacts coated with lacquer are made in all Asian countries. Traditional lacquer objects pose a particular conservation challenge. It's an organic resin. It can suffer physical damage, as you saw on the top of the table. And like I was saying, newly cured lacquer is very durable and unaffected by most acids and bases, most organic solvents and water. It's also impervious to, and impervious to insect attack. But after the exposure to ultraviolet light and temperature extremes, this causes the breakdown of the lacquer and can become very soluble. The substrates, like I said, in this case was wood, can be also cloth, metal, or clay, and those can deteriorate over time too once moisture and humidity can enter after the lacquer surface has started to flake. Asian methods of lacquer, traditionally, they used it for both consolidation, fills, and surface coatings. And when applied by skilled hands, the material can really improve the appearance and is very compatible with the original lacquer. But again, because this lacquer is so toxic, causing a severe poison ivy-like rash, unless the user has built up an immunity, we just don't do it much here in the East. Also, once it's cured, it's insoluble. So if you make a mistake, those mistakes can't be undone. So again, the comparison between the Western methods and the Eastern methods, where our consolidants can be reversed. The fish glue that Ellen was using is soluble in water always, and also changes that are made to the object during treatment are more easily identified oftentimes in the West because of the difference in materials, like I was saying, as opposed to recoating it with the same material, where you can't tell what was new and what was old. So I just wanted to make sure I said all those important things. So now on to something completely different. Here is a painting that shows different types of bamboo furniture made both for the Chinese and for the export markets. This furniture was inexpensive, lightweight, and very popular. It looked delicate, but it was actually very sturdy. And it immediately imparted a Chinese look to any room, which was a desirable thing, especially in the early 1800s. So here we are back in the Quincy house. We see this suite of bamboo furniture. There's 4 chairs and a settee. So this picture was taken in, in 1874. We know that this furniture was acquired and brought to the Quincy house in 1805. So very early in the China trade, likely came on one of the earliest ships. But by the time Historic New England got the Quincy house in 1937, the bamboo suite was gone. It was either removed earlier or destroyed. So as part of the 2011 refurbishing plan, our curator, Nancy Carlisle, looked through our collection and happened to find this very similar set of bamboo furniture, that also had been donated to us by a descendant of a Boston merchant who dealt in Chinese goods. So very, very similar to the original set. So they had been in storage for many years, and the goal was to go from this slide on the left before to the after treatment. So how do we do that? You notice that the biggest problem are these missing little decorative bent pieces of cane. So this was both bamboo. These windows, I like to call them, were made out of cut bamboo. Oops, excuse me. So all the thicker pieces were bamboo and all the inner pieces were wicker. So I ordered some rolls of wicker that came in the same thickness as the bamboo, and started cutting it to piece it into the missing chairs. So first completing these windows, starting with a straight piece and just notching it into to this hexagon shape. While doing that, I noticed how each of these pieces had these slots in them. And that was a clue to what the pattern was inside the window. Here you can see these holes are a different size than the one in the last picture. If you had two pieces of cane in the hole, you had a bigger hole than the one piece of cane. So it was a bit of a puzzle, but by looking closely at all the chairs and some pictures of other chairs, they had a lot of repeating patterns, and I was able to figure out the design of the caning that went inside these windows. So then how do you do it? What I learned about cane was that once it's wet, it's very flexible. And then when it dries, if it dries in a shape, it will hold that shape. So we needed a jig. So this was the first very simple jig made out of nails. I traced the shape I wanted out of a pipe cleaner, and then just drew that on this piece of wood, tapped in the nails, and wrapped the piece of cane around through the nails to hold it in that form. So here you can see the difference between the new pieces and the old. The new pieces are lighter. So after I did this and then went in to in-paint them to tone them to match, I realized how difficult it was to tone them once they were already in place. So I got smart and did the toning and the soaking at the same time. Here you see my very messy workbench, and these, so here are the hanks of cane that you can purchase in all different thicknesses. And then these are vats of dilute acrylic paint. So I would soak a length of the cane in the acrylic paint and then weave it through the jig here to make all these different shapes, and then just insert them, cut them, and place them in their resting place, kind of fitting them back into the puzzle, basically. So there's an example of a finished treatment, and then here they are in the hall. We took all these photographs to match, to mimic the 1870s photos. So here's the set in place in the hall. And now for our last treatment, we're back at Beauport. Here is the China Trade Room once again, photo taken in 1934, right after Sleeper died. And what we're looking at are these hanging lanterns. Here in a later photo with the McCann furniture, it's hard to see, but all we had was hanging light bulbs. So we went on a hunt for these missing lanterns. And in one of the storage rooms at Beauport, we found the lantern, one lantern, pretty seriously damaged. You can see there's copper wire holding it together here. This element is missing on this side. One of these panes of reverse painted glass was broken, and it was just kind of smashed up. So the goal was to find another lantern, or a pair, or something else. So we decided we couldn't find another lantern that was similar, that was of such good quality that matched the one we already had. It would have been very difficult to find a matching lantern, and new lanterns to be purchased just didn't look as good and were very expensive. So a colleague suggested this person whose name was Ji Peng, who happened to live in Western New Hampshire and could possibly help me out. So we talked, and he said if I could fix the old one, he could make a new one. So I set out to repair the original. He also mentioned that the original was made out of Chinese rosewood, which is a very dense, high quality wood that's hard to carve and hard to come by. He had some, and so he made the few missing pieces of the original lantern. Those structural elements he carved out of rosewood and I assembled, but he thought he would make the replica lantern out of maple. A nice hard wood, easier to carve. He used a CNC machine actually to carve the fretwork, so that he could just make one side and then the machine would make the duplicate copies. And then I would tone the whole thing to match. So here you see it, and now we're going to go backwards a little bit. So here I am deassembling in order to reassemble. So what I basically did was take it all apart and then take molds using dental plaster of the existing pieces. Here's the dental plaster mold, and then make casts of those parts in bulked epoxy, and then trim and fit the pieces in where they were missing to kind of complete the decorative element. Here I am trimming with little chisels the epoxy, and there you have it. The epoxy was then in painted. This is a great picture because it shows the detail right here. This is actually inlaid metal, this metal wire. It was very difficult to see. I think it was originally silver, silver colored, and now it's tarnished, so it's kind of black, but it just shows how nice these were, what craftsmanship went into these original lanterns to have this thin inlaid wire all around the framework of the window panes. Oop, excuse me, there's my timer, so I must be talking too much. Anyway, another thing that we did was recreate the reverse painted glass. So this, after removing all these kind of window panes, I sent the glass to be replicated, and then on the new lantern had to replicate these kind of panes that held the glass in. These corner elements, these little bats, were just incredible. They were all hand carved and actually carved on both sides, which amazed me. So I again molded and cast these bats and little donuts, and put them into the frames that G made to hold the new reverse painted glass. And here's that. This was sent out to a artist in Massachusetts who works specifically with reverse painted glass, and she did an amazing job copying the originals, which were on the top, the originals. Here's a close-up of the carved replica, and here I am toning the replica, and you can see these are the frames with the bats and donuts added in that the glass went into. On the inside was red toned paper. I added that, and here is the lantern reassembled and the replica. So please come to Beauport to the China Trade Room and see if you can tell which one is the original and which one's the replica. And there they are hanging above the piano. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you everyone who worked on all these great treatments and shared their advice and information with me. And I'm happy to take any questions. I hope that made sense.
Yes, I think it did. Thank you so much, Michaela. We do have some questions here in the queue. So the first one we have is someone thought that lacquer was made from insects/beetles. So can you talk a little bit more about what traditional lacquer is made out of?
Yes. So it's a very confusing term because it's a kind of a broad term. This piece that you're looking at, this red piece and the black lacquer I showed, I mean, lacquer is clear. True Urushi lacquer is made from this plant that is related to poison ivy that I mentioned. Shellac is made from an insect, and that's a material that we use that we dilute with ethanol. But any lacquer, I mean, people call nail polish lacquer. So it's really a hard, shiny coating, and that's the general term for lacquer. But when we're talking about Asian lacquer, although the trees grow in different places, and with analysis, there are some differences between lacquer from Japan, lacquer from China, lacquer from Korea. They can be grouped as part of the urushi tree, the urushi family.
Mm-hmm.
So that's this toxic lacquer that it's like many layers of lacquer make up these objects. The lacquer is extracted from the tree. It's boiled down. It's a huge process, and then the layers are brushed on one coat at a time in an extremely humid enclosed room. And the humidity helps to harden the lacquer. So it's a very time consuming, very elaborate process that we just have not mastered here. And I don't think we could really do it here just with the climate and the lack of materials.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really interesting, the complexity of something like that. We have another question about, what was the hardest restoration project you've ever had to work on?
Well, I'll tell you that lantern was not easy. That's for sure. That was much harder than the bamboo chairs. That was up there. That's a tough question. I'd have to think about that one. Metals are hard for me. You didn't see any metals in this presentation.
Mm-hmm. So how many people are working on object conservation work here at Historic New England?
Just two at this point, myself and the postgraduate fellow. Our current fellow specializes in furniture conservation. So there's these three, I meant to say, there's basically areas of focus for conservation. When you go to graduate school, you generally choose between the conservation of paintings, of works of art on paper, or of objects. And objects is a very broad category, and that's what I specialized in, if you could say specialized. Sometimes within objects, it's divided into organic objects and inorganic objects. And so I prefer organic objects, which are wood and feathers and leather, as opposed to inorganic, which would be metals or stone, things like that. Ceramics can be very difficult also. So our fellow now, although she specialized in objects, she has a subspecialty in furniture or wooden artifacts, and is trying to specifically learn more about those while she's here at Historic New England.
I see. So yeah, we have a rotating cadre of people that come in and out because of the fellowship.
Yes.
We have someone who is a fiber artist and wants to know, how do we restore fiber arts artifacts?
That's another specialty into itself, textile conservation. I have studied with some textile conservators and learned a little. There are some similarities between textile conservation and paper conservation, and I learned some of that while at school. So depending on the complexity of the treatment, I will do some textile treatments, basic washing of white textiles, some basic mending. But if it's an advanced project, I will send it to a textile conservator. And I will say some of the hardest treatments that I've seen have been textile treatments, because they just, like silk, shatters and is so delicate that it's extremely difficult to handle and to work with. And once things have faded, there's no way you can bring that color back except with an overlay of another fabric on top of it or something like that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Just thinking about how hard it is to treat your own moth damaged clothes as far as, something that's 100 years old, or the damage must just be so hard to deal with. Um, Someone wants to know how we treat and restore leather objects.
Leather is also an interesting and difficult material. I like working with leather, but once it ages, it gets very acidic and brittle, and it can't be de-acidified or made less brittle. So once it's gone bad, there's really no bringing it back. But before it's gone to that point of no return, you can mend it, you can stabilize it. I actually often use Japanese tissue and a flexible acrylic adhesive as a Band-Aid. If there's a crack in a piece of leather, like underneath on the non-show surface of the leather, you can span the gap with this Band-Aid of tissue and a flexible adhesive. It's removable, and it doesn't make the leather more brittle. It doesn't add acids to the leather, which would further exacerbate its deterioration. But you wouldn't, people think to use waxes or oils. There's a lot of like leather treatment products out there, like leather restorers, they're called. But those are really for leather, like saddles, horse tack, riding tack, baseball gloves, things that you use that you want to keep soft. Like, yes, you might put oil on your baseball glove or wax, but an art objects, you wouldn't do that. It darkens, it attracts dirt and dust. And ultimately those waxes and oils break down and cause more problems. So we do avoid using those.
Well, that is it for the questions that we have for tonight. If anyone on this, we got maybe one more quick question here. Are there any plans for more exhibitions, talk on restoration for at Historic New England? We do have a series of programs that we're doing on these subjects. So I would say right now, I don't think there's anything else on the calendar right now, but we continue to add things throughout the year. So we will be doing more of these kinds of talks.
Yeah.
It's just don't have anything scheduled right now, but just keep an eye out, sign up for our newsletters, and you'll definitely see that there'll be more programs on these sort of topics. Michaela, do you know of anything that's in the works?
A little. Well, we're hoping actually to do a program in person at Beauport. We've done this in the past where the conservators are stationed in different rooms and we talk about the treatments right there at the house. And that's a great opportunity to see furniture and glass and lacquer and textiles, all different, because Beauport has so many objects. And we've treated so many objects there that we hope to do that this coming summer. So stay tuned, keep an eye out for that. Also on the website for Artful Stories, the web app, there are some, if you like do the deep zoom in the web app, we talk about some of the treatments of the frames for those objects.
Yes.
And actually, yeah, so looking deep on the website, there's a couple of glimpses, like blog posts on conservation.
Mm-hmm. I can't remember if the program that you did on frame treatment is on our YouTube channel or not.
I don't think it is.
Okay, I didn't think so, but I mean, I think at some point there will be on the YouTube channel, but there will be more content on conservation and restoration kind of things coming.
And feel free to suggest what you might want to see.
Yeah. I mean, certainly we would love to hear what people are particularly interested in. And on that note, we will be sending out a follow-up email. And if you have additional questions, or want to give us feedback about what you would be interested in hearing more about, please just reply to that email. You can see that Michaela has her email address on this slide here, but I'll also provide it in that follow-up email. And again, the program was recorded, so if you missed any part of it, you will receive a link and password to immediately access the recording of this program, even if though it's not going to be public for a little bit. So with that, thank you so much, Michaela, for this really fascinating look at all the various really variety of objects of Asian origin that we have here at Historic New England, and how we've restored them to some of their former glory. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great evening.
Everyone. Have a great evening. Thanks, Claire, so much.
Thank you.